The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown driveway as Frank Reed pulled up to the abandoned farmhouse for the first time. At 42, he hadn't planned on making such a dramatic life change, but after 20 years of teaching history at a bustling city university, the quiet countryside called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. Frank shut off the engine of his worn sedan and sat for a moment, taking in the sight before him. The two-story farmhouse stood like a time capsule against the backdrop of rolling Pennsylvania hills. Its white paint had long since faded to a weathered gray, peeling in strips that curled away from the wooden siding. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on one side, and several of the upstairs windows were boarded up with plywood that had itself begun to warp with age. Yet despite its obvious state of disrepair, Frank saw something in the old place that stirred his soul. Perhaps it was the solid stone foundation, or the elegant proportions of the 19th century architecture, or simply the way it stood defiantly after all these years of neglect. Whatever it was, Frank had made up his mind the moment he spotted the online listing 3 weeks ago. "Well, you're either the smartest or the dumbest man I've ever sold a house to," said a voice from behind him. Frank turned to see his realtor, Bill Thompson, pulling up in his shiny SUV. Bill was a sturdy man in his 50s with a perpetual look of mild amusement on his face, as if the world was constantly telling him jokes that weren't quite funny enough to laugh at. "Probably a bit of both," Frank admitted as he stepped out of his car. The autumn air felt crisp and clean compared to the city smog he was used to. Bill joined him, clipboard in hand. Most folks want new construction these days. Granite countertops, smart home features, not... He gestured broadly at the dilapidated structure. "Whatever you'd call this." "I'd call it history," Frank replied, already walking toward the house. "And that's kind of my thing." The property had been sitting on the market for nearly 3 years. According to Bill, locals avoided it due to rumors about Old Man Jenkins, the previous owner who had died without any known relatives about 18 years ago. The county had finally taken possession after years of unpaid taxes. "What kind of rumors?" Frank had asked during their phone conversations. "Oh, nothing sinister," Bill had assured him. "Just that he was odd. Kept to himself. Always tinkering around in that basement of his. Some folks said he was paranoid about government surveillance. Others thought he might have been hiding money from the IRS. Small-town gossip. That's all." Now, as they approached the front steps, Bill handed Frank a thick folder. "Here's everything the county had on file about the property. Original blueprints from 1887, record of renovations in the 1930s, and the inspection report I warned you about." Frank thumbed through the folder, pausing on the inspection summary page with its long list of needed repairs highlighted in alarming red. Roof replacement, electrical rewiring, plumbing overhaul, possible foundation issues, evidence of water damage in the kitchen and master bedroom. "And you're absolutely sure you don't want to reconsider?" Bill asked. "I've got a nice ranch-style home just 15 minutes from here. Built in 2010, move-in ready." Frank shook his head and looked up at the farmhouse. A pair of barn swallows darted from beneath the eaves. "No, this is the one." The key stuck in the lock, requiring Bill to jiggle it while applying his shoulder to the door. It finally swung open with a dramatic creak that seemed almost too perfect, as if the house itself was playing the part of a haunted mansion. The interior smelled of dust and forgotten things. Sheets draped over furniture created ghost-like silhouettes in the living room. Cobwebs stretched across doorways like silvery curtains. Their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors, which, surprisingly, seemed in decent condition beneath years of grime. 5 acres of land, Bill said as they moved through the house. "Property line extends to that creek you can see from the kitchen window. Barn needs work, but the structure's sound. There's also a small workshop behind it that's not half bad." Frank was only half listening. His attention was caught by the craftsmanship evident even beneath the neglect. The carved banister of the main staircase, the crown molding in what must have been a formal dining room, the built-in bookshelves flanking a stone fireplace. "The price is so low because of the condition?" Frank asked, running his hand along a windowsill where the afternoon light revealed years of accumulated dust. Bill laughed. "That, and because nobody wants to live 20 minutes from the nearest grocery store these days. Plus, there's all those repairs. You're looking at investing at least as much as the purchase price to make it livable." They made their way upstairs, where 3 bedrooms and a surprisingly spacious bathroom awaited similar states of abandonment. In what was clearly the master bedroom, Yellowed newspapers from 1998 still lay on a reading table, as if Old Man Jenkins had just stepped out for a moment. The tour continued to the kitchen with its ancient appliances, and then to a narrow door that led to the basement stairs. "Watch your step here," Bill cautioned, flipping a light switch that, remarkably, still worked. A single bare bulb illuminated a steep wooden staircase. The inspector noted these weren't up to code. Frank gripped the wobbly handrail as they descended into the cool, damp basement. Unlike the rest of the house, which seemed frozen in the late 1990s, the basement had an altogether different feeling, older, more deliberate in its construction. Stone walls surrounded them on all sides, and the floor was poured concrete that had cracked in several places. Metal shelving units lined the walls, still holding dusty mason jars, tools, and cardboard boxes labeled in faded handwriting. "Jenkins seems to have spent a lot of time down here," Bill observed, pointing to a workbench that ran along one wall. The county folks who cleaned out the place said they found all sorts of weird electrical gadgets. Ham radio equipment mostly. Frank noticed something unusual about the basement's dimensions. The room seemed smaller than it should be given the size of the house above. Bill shrugged. "Old houses are full of quirks. Could be part of the foundation is solid stone, or maybe they walled off a section when they poured the concrete floor." After completing the tour, they stood once more on the front porch. The setting sun painted the overgrown fields in gold, and somewhere in the distance an owl began its evening calls. "So," Bill said, "still interested in taking on this money pit?" Frank's answer was immediate. "Absolutely. Let's start the paperwork." 2 weeks later, Frank sat at his apartment surrounded by boxes. His resignation from the university had raised eyebrows among his colleagues. His department chair had been particularly bewildered. "You're leaving to do what? Restore an old farmhouse? Have you ever even held a hammer?" The truth was, Frank had very limited experience with home repairs. His knowledge of history may have been extensive, but his practical skills were lacking. Still, something about this project felt right. In a world of digital screens and constant noise, the idea of working with his hands to bring something back to life appealed to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. The closing process had been surprisingly simple. With cash from his modest inheritance following his mother's passing last year, Frank was able to buy the property outright. No mortgage necessary. The low price, barely more than a new luxury car, made even his substantial renovation budget seem reasonable. His phone buzzed with a text from Bill. "Keys are under the mat on the front porch. Welcome home, Professor." Home. The word felt strange yet fitting. Despite having never spent a single night there, the old farmhouse already felt more like home than his sterile apartment ever had. The next morning, Frank loaded the last of his essential belongings into his car and a small rented moving trailer. Most of his furniture would remain in storage until the major renovations were complete. For now, he had a camping cot, basic kitchen supplies, and boxes of books he couldn't bear to leave behind. As he pulled away from the apartment building, Frank felt none of the nostalgia he might have expected. Instead, a sense of adventure filled his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his graduate school days when the world seemed full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The drive to his new home took just under 2 hours. With each mile that carried him away from the city, Frank felt the tension in his shoulders ease. By the time he turned onto the gravel road that led to the farmhouse, he was smiling. This time, when he pulled up to the house, it wasn't as a prospective buyer but as its owner. The responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. This wasn't just a place to live, it was a piece of history that had been entrusted to his care. Frank stepped out of his car and took a deep breath of country air. A light breeze rustled through the tall grass, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker drummed against a tree. "Well," he said aloud to no one in particular, "let's get started." Little did Frank know that beneath his feet, sealed away in darkness for nearly a century, lay secrets that would change everything, not just for him, but for the understanding of an entire era of local history. But for now, he was simply a man with a new home, standing on the threshold of his next great adventure. Frank spent his first week at the farmhouse in a constant state of both excitement and overwhelm. Each morning he woke on his camping cot with sunlight streaming through windows that desperately needed washing. And each night he fell asleep with a notebook filled with that day's discoveries and an ever-growing to-do list. The house, he quickly learned, was full of surprises, some delightful, others concerning. Start with the roof, his friend Tom had advised during their phone call. Tom worked as a contractor in the city and had promised to visit once a month to help with the bigger projects. Everything else is pointless if rain keeps getting in. Frank had taken this advice to heart and hired a local roofing company recommended by Bill the realtor. The crew arrived on his third day of ownership, a team of 4 men who spoke little but worked with impressive efficiency. Seen worse, the foreman, a weathered man named Pete, had commented after his initial inspection. Should take us about a week. Got some rotted wood to replace along with the shingles. While the roofing crew worked above, Frank focused on clearing out the interior. Most of Old Man Jenkins' possessions had been removed years ago by the county, but enough remained to fill a growing pile of trash bags on the front lawn. Moldy curtains, broken lamps, magazines from the 1990s with water-warped pages, yet not everything was destined for the dump. In the back of a kitchen cabinet, Frank found a set of cast-iron cookware that, beneath layers of dust and grease, appeared to be in excellent condition. A trunk in the attic yielded a collection of hardback books from the 1930s and 40s, their pages yellowed but intact. Treasures hiding in plain sight, Frank murmured as he carefully wiped decades of dust from a first-edition Hemingway. By the end of that first week, Frank had established a routine. Mornings were spent working alongside the roofers, learning what he could about basic construction. Afternoons were dedicated to sorting through the house room by room, separating trash from treasures. Evenings found him at the rickety kitchen table, researching local history and planning his next steps over a simple dinner. It was during one of these evening sessions that Frank first noticed something odd about the house plans. The original blueprints he had received from Bill showed a fairly standard layout for a farmhouse of that era, a central hallway with rooms branching off on either side. But as Frank compared the blueprints to the actual house, small discrepancies began to emerge. The kitchen was exactly as shown on the plans, as was the living room. But the dining room seemed narrower than it should have been, and a small pantry off the kitchen appeared to take up less space than the blueprints suggested. Could just be inaccurate measurements, Frank told himself. But his historian's instinct, the same one that had led him to question established narratives in his academic work, whispered that there was more to it. The next morning, Frank took a tape measure and began to map out the exact dimensions of the first floor. The results confirmed his suspicion. There was roughly a 3-foot discrepancy between the exterior measurements and the sum of the interior rooms. Houses this old often have thick walls, Pete commented when Frank mentioned it to him during a coffee break. Insulation was different back then, but 3 feet seemed excessive, even accounting for thick walls. Frank's curiosity was piqued. That afternoon, as he cleared out the dining room, Frank paid special attention to the walls, tapping along them and listening for any change in sound that might indicate a hollow space. Nothing seemed unusual until he reached the built-in china cabinet that occupied most of the north wall. Unlike the rest of the woodwork in the house, which was ornate and clearly original, this cabinet appeared to be a later addition. Its style was simpler, the wood a slightly different shade. When Frank tried to move it to clean behind, he discovered it was firmly attached to the wall, not just mounted, but seemingly built into it. With growing excitement, Frank began removing the shelves, looking for any sign of a hidden mechanism. The back panel of the cabinet sounded hollow when tapped, but he could find no way to open it. "Maybe I'm reading too much into this," he muttered, stepping back to assess the cabinet with a critical eye. As a historian specializing in 19th century America, Frank was well aware of hidden rooms and passages from that era, spaces used during Prohibition or as part of the Underground Railroad. But such features were rare, and finding one would be extraordinarily lucky. Frank's attention shifted to the floor, where he noticed something he had previously overlooked. The hardwood planks beneath the cabinet ran perpendicular to those in the rest of the room. A small detail, easily dismissed but potentially significant. Dropping to his knees, Frank ran his fingers along the edge where the flooring changed direction. There, almost invisible beneath years of grime, was a thin seam that extended beyond the cabinet's footprint. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, his pulse quickening. The next day, Frank devoted himself entirely to the china cabinet mystery. With careful work and liberal application of WD-40 to hinges that hadn't moved in decades, he managed to detach the cabinet from the wall without damaging either. Behind it was a wall that, at first glance, appeared no different from any other in the house. But upon closer inspection, Frank could see the faint outline of a door, expertly blended into the surrounding plaster and painted over countless times. No handle or knob was visible, but the perpendicular floorboards now made sense. They concealed a pressure plate. Frank stepped on various boards, applying weight in different spots, until he heard a soft click from within the wall. The hidden door opened just a crack, enough for Frank to slip his fingers in and pull it fully open, revealing a narrow space about the size of a small closet. Inside was nothing but dust, cobwebs, and a single wooden box about the size of a shoebox. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the box and carried it to the kitchen table. The wood was dark with age but finely crafted, with dovetail joints at the corners and a simple brass latch. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a leather-bound journal and a small collection of items: a pocket watch, a brass key with an unusual tooth pattern, and a folded piece of yellowed paper that proved to be a hand-drawn map of the property. Frank opened the journal carefully, mindful of the brittle pages. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink faded to a soft brown. The first entry was dated April 17, 1897. Construction of the secure room completed today. Reynolds did excellent work. None would suspect its existence. The materials are safely stored, though I pray they need never be used. In these uncertain times, however, preparation is prudence, not paranoia. Frank read late into the night, piecing together the story told through scattered entries. The journal belonged to the original owner of the house, a man named Henry Blackwood, who appeared to have been involved in local politics and had connections to labor movements of the late 1800s. References to the room appeared throughout, along with cryptic mentions of papers, evidence, and materials that must remain hidden. Blackwood seemed concerned about unnamed enemies and the possibility of his home being searched. The most intriguing entry, dated October 3, 1901, read, "Added reinforcement to the basement access today. The main entrance remains concealed behind the shelving, but I've added a secondary point of entry through the stone wall, accessible only with knowledge of its existence. The key is distinctive. I keep it with me always." Frank glanced at the brass key from the box, wondering if it might be the one mentioned in the journal. But what did it open? And where was this secure room located? The journal's final entry was dated June 8, 1915, and was notably brief. "War in Europe grows worse. Fear similar conflict may reach our shores. Have added latest documents to the collection. May those who find this understand the importance of preservation." After that, nothing, leaving Frank with far more questions than answers. The next morning, Frank found himself standing in the basement, journal and key in hand, studying the stone walls with newfound interest. The basement was largely empty now, as he had cleared out the remaining boxes and tools left by Jenkins. What had initially seemed like an ordinary basement now felt full of possibility. Frank recalled his initial observation about the room's dimensions being smaller than expected. He also remembered the workbench that had been built against the far wall, the wall that, according to his calculations, might be hiding additional space behind it. "If I were hiding a secret room," Frank murmured, "where would I put the entrance?" The workbench itself was massive, solid oak that had darkened with age. Frank had assumed it was built in place, as it seemed too large to have been moved down the narrow stairs. Now he wondered if it served a dual purpose. Setting the journal aside but keeping the key in his pocket, Frank began to examine every inch of the workbench and the wall behind it, looking for any sign of a hidden mechanism or keyhole. The answer, when he found it, was almost disappointingly simple. Behind a drawer that had been stuck shut, Frank discovered a small brass plate that matched the unusual pattern of the key. His hand shook slightly as he inserted the key, heard a satisfying click, and watched as a previously invisible seam appeared in the stone wall. "Unbelievable," he whispered, as a section of the wall, disguised to look like solid stone but actually a cleverly designed door, swung silently inward on well-oiled hinges. Beyond lay darkness, and the promise of a 100-year-old secret finally revealed. Frank stood frozen at the threshold of the hidden doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. The beam from his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a room that hadn't been exposed to fresh air in what must have been decades. "Hello?" he called out instinctively, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Of course no one answered. Whoever had sealed this room had been gone for a very long time. Taking a deep breath, Frank stepped forward. The air inside was surprisingly dry, with none of the mustiness he had expected. The room was larger than he had anticipated, perhaps 15 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that he could stand comfortably. Unlike the rough stone walls of the main basement, these walls were smoothly finished with plaster and painted a faded cream color. As Frank swept his flashlight around, the beam caught on something that made his breath catch. Shelves upon shelves lined the walls, filled with wooden crates, stacks of paper, and what appeared to be dozens of leather-bound books and folders. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself. Frank had spent his career studying history, but always through the lens of what others had already discovered and documented. Never had he imagined finding a pristine time capsule like this, his own historical treasure trove, perfectly preserved and waiting just for him. Setting his flashlight on a small table in the center of the room, Frank noticed a wall-mounted oil lamp nearby. Curious if it would still work after all these years, he pulled a lighter from his pocket and carefully applied the flame to the wick. To his amazement, the lamp caught immediately, casting a warm golden glow throughout the space. "Well maintained," Frank murmured, impressed by the foresight of whoever had prepared this room. He found 2 more similar lamps around the room and lit those as well. Finally able to fully appreciate what he had discovered, the wooden crates were stacked methodically, each one labeled with a date range and a brief description of its contents. Frank approached the nearest one, which was marked 1898-1901 Coal Strike Correspondence. With gentle hands, he lifted the lid to reveal dozens of letters, neatly bundled with twine and organized chronologically. Selecting one bundle, Frank carefully untied the twine and opened the top letter. It was dated September 14, 1899, and addressed to Henry Blackwood, the journal's author. The letter was from someone named William Barrett, who appeared to be a labor organizer discussing plans for an upcoming miners' strike. These must be primary sources, Frank realized, his academic mind racing. Original documents that historians might not even know exist. As a professor who had specialized in labor movements of the late 19th century, Frank understood immediately the potential significance of what he was holding. These weren't just old papers. They were possibly untapped resources that could shed new light on a pivotal period in American labor history. Moving methodically around the room, Frank examined the labels on more crates. Railroad Union documents, 1903-1907, Socialist press clippings, 1908-1912, War preparations, 1914-1918. Each crate promised a wealth of historical information, but it was a smaller wooden box, tucked away in the corner, that truly caught Frank's attention. Unlike the other containers, this one had no label, only a small brass padlock securing its lid. Frank examined the lock, noting its age and simple design. He hesitated only briefly before retrieving a small toolbox he had left in the main basement area. Returning with a hammer and flathead screwdriver, he carefully pried the lock open, feeling only a twinge of guilt at the minor destruction. Inside the box, nestled in a bed of what appeared to be silk, lay a stack of photographs, a small leather pouch, and a folded document bearing an official-looking seal. Frank carefully lifted out the document first, unfolding it with delicate fingers. It was a deed, not to the farmhouse property, but to a mine located about 30 miles away. According to the listed coordinates, the unusual part was the owner's name: Blackwood Cooperative Mining Association. A cooperative mine? Frank said aloud, his interest thoroughly piqued. Worker-owned cooperatives had been rare in that era, often actively suppressed by larger corporate interests. The photographs showed groups of men standing proudly in front of mine entrances, as well as what appeared to be community gatherings, picnics, meetings, and construction projects. On the back of each photo was a date and brief description in the same neat handwriting from the journal. The leather pouch contained several coins and what appeared to be membership tokens for the cooperative, each stamped with a pick and shovel crossed over the letters BCMA. "This is incredible," Frank muttered, carefully returning the items to their box. A sudden noise from upstairs, the distinctive sound of a vehicle pulling into the gravel driveway, startled Frank from his historical reverie. He checked his watch, surprised to find that nearly 3 hours had passed since he'd first opened the hidden door. The roofing crew wasn't scheduled for today, which meant he had an unexpected visitor. Reluctantly, Frank extinguished the oil lamps and exited the hidden room, making sure the stone door closed securely behind him. He would return to his discoveries soon enough, but first he needed to see who had come calling. Taking the basement steps 2 at a time, Frank reached the main floor just as a knock sounded at the front door. Through the dusty window, he could see an older model pickup truck parked outside. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with an elderly man wearing a flannel shirt and well-worn jeans. Despite his age, Frank guessed him to be in his 80s. The man stood straight, with alert eyes that immediately assessed Frank with undisguised curiosity. "You must be the new owner," the man said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Harold Wilson. I live about 3 miles down the road." "Frank Reed," Frank replied, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you." Harold's handshake was firm. "Folks in town are talking about the city professor who bought old Jenkins' place. Thought I'd come see for myself." Frank smiled, recognizing the thinly veiled pretext for what it was. Simple, small-town curiosity. "Would you like to come in? I can't offer much in the way of hospitality yet, but I've got coffee." "Coffee sounds fine," Harold said, stepping past Frank into the house. His eyes swept the interior, taking in the partially cleared rooms and ongoing work. "You've got your hands full here." "That I do," Frank agreed, leading the way to the kitchen where his camping stove was set up on the counter. He filled a kettle and set it to boil. "But I'm enjoying the challenge." Harold settled into one of the kitchen chairs with the ease of someone accustomed to making himself at home wherever he went. "I knew old Jenkins, you know. Not well, nobody knew him well, but better than most." Frank's interest perked up immediately. "Really? I'd love to hear about him. The realtor couldn't tell me much." "Jenkins was odd, no doubt about that," Harold said, accepting the mug of instant coffee Frank offered him. "Moved here in the late 70s. Kept to himself mostly. Always working on some project or another in that basement of his." "Did he ever mention anything unusual about the house? Its history, maybe?" Frank asked, trying to sound casual. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "You found something, didn't you?" Frank hesitated. He had only just met Harold and wasn't sure how much he wanted to share about his discoveries. On the other hand, a longtime local might have valuable context that could help him understand what he'd found. "I might have," he admitted finally. "There seems to be more to this house than meets the eye." Harold nodded slowly. "Jenkins used to talk sometimes when he'd had a few drinks at the local bar. Said this place had secrets. Most folks thought he was just being dramatic or maybe going senile toward the end. But there was one thing he mentioned that always stuck with me." "What's that?" Frank asked, leaning forward. "He said he'd found evidence that the original owner, Blackwood, I think the name was involved in something called the People's History Project. Said it was some kind of effort to preserve the stories of ordinary folks, workers, mainly, who'd been written out of the official historical records." Frank felt a jolt of excitement. This aligned perfectly with what he'd found. "Did Jenkins ever say what happened to this evidence?" Harold shook his head. If he found anything concrete, he kept it to himself. But he did say one thing that might interest you. He believed there was a network of people involved in this project, folks who had hidden important documents and artifacts in their homes all across the county. Said Blackwood's house, this house was just one node in a larger web. Frank's mind raced with the implications. If Harold was right, the hidden room might be part of something much bigger than one man's private collection. It could be a piece of an organized effort to preserve an alternative historical record, one told from the perspective of workers rather than industrialists or politicians. Did Jenkins ever mention any other locations? Other houses that might have been involved? Frank asked. Not specifically, Harold replied. But he did have a map he'd sometimes pore over when he thought nobody was looking. Had all sorts of markings on it, stars, circles, lines connecting different points. Never got a good look at it myself. Frank thought of the folded map he'd found in the wooden box alongside the journal. Could it be the same one? Thank you for telling me this, Frank said sincerely. It helps put some things in perspective. Harold studied him over the rim of his coffee mug. You seem like a decent sort. Whatever you've found, I hope you'll do right by it. There's history in these hills that deserves to be remembered. That's exactly what I intend to do, Frank assured him. After Harold left, promising to return with some fresh vegetables from his garden, Frank stood in the kitchen for a long moment, processing what he'd learned. The hidden room wasn't just a fascinating discovery. It was potentially part of a deliberate, organized effort to preserve a particular kind of historical record. As a professional historian, Frank understood the significance of such an effort. History was typically written by the victors, by those in power. The stories of ordinary working people, especially those who challenged the established order, were often minimized or erased entirely. With renewed purpose, Frank headed back to the basement. The hidden room awaited him along with all its secrets, and now he had context that made those secrets even more valuable, not just to him, but potentially to the entire historical record. As he re-entered the hidden chamber and lit the oil lamps once more, Frank felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him. He was no longer just a homeowner who had stumbled upon an interesting find. He was now the caretaker of voices from the past that had been deliberately preserved, waiting for someone to finally hear them and share their stories with the world. Over the next week, Frank barely left the basement. He set up a proper work area in the hidden room, bringing down a folding table, his laptop, and proper lighting. The roof repair continued overhead, but Frank's mind was entirely occupied by the historical treasure trove he'd discovered. Each box contained meticulously preserved documents, organized with a historian's care. Frank worked systematically, photographing each item before handling it further, creating a digital record of everything he found. His academic training proved invaluable as he sorted through letters, newspaper clippings, pamphlets, and meeting minutes from various labor organizations dating from the 1890s through the 1920s. This is bigger than me, Frank realized after several days of cataloging. The scope of the collection was vast, documenting not just local events but connecting them to national movements. There were original letters from well-known labor leaders, documents about strikes that had barely been mentioned in official histories, and evidence of community organizing that challenged the traditional narrative about that era. Frank knew he needed help both to understand the full significance of what he'd found and to ensure it was properly preserved. After careful consideration, he decided to reach out to the County Historical Society. The Riverside County Historical Society was housed in a modest brick building that had once been the town's library. When Frank pushed open the door, a small bell jingled overhead, and a gray-haired woman looked up from behind a cluttered desk. "Good morning," she said, setting aside a stack of papers. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Frank replied. "I recently bought the old Blackwood farmhouse about 20 minutes outside town, and I've found something that might interest the Historical Society." The woman's eyes widened. "The Blackwood place? That's been empty for years." "Yes, since Jenkins died," Frank confirmed. "I'm Frank Reed, by the way." "Dorothy Parker," the woman said, standing to shake his hand. "I'm the Society's director, which is a fancy way of saying I'm the only paid employee." "What have you found, Mr. Reed?" Frank hesitated. He had decided not to reveal the full extent of his discovery until he knew more about the Historical Society and its approach to preservation. "Some old documents," he said carefully. "They appear to be related to labor organizing in this area during the late 1800s and early 1900s. I was hoping you might have some context that could help me understand their significance." Dorothy's eyebrows rose. "Labor history? That's something of a specialty of mine, actually. We don't have much from that era. Most records were lost or deliberately destroyed during the coal company's purge in the 1920s. "Purge?" Frank asked, his interest piqued. Dorothy nodded grimly. "After the failed strike of 1922, Pennsylvania Coal consolidated its power in this region. They bought up newspapers, installed company men in local government, and systematically eliminated evidence of worker organizing. Historical accounts from that period are, well, let's just say they reflect the company's perspective rather than the workers. This aligned perfectly with what Harold had told him about the People's History Project being an effort to preserve stories that had been written out of official records. "That's fascinating," Frank said. "Would you be willing to look at a few of the documents I've found? I brought some copies." He patted his messenger bag. "I'd be delighted," Dorothy replied, gesturing to a reading table near the window. Frank pulled out several carefully made photocopies. He hadn't wanted to risk bringing original documents. He watched as Dorothy examined them, her expression growing increasingly astonished. "Mr. Reed," she said finally, looking up with wide eyes, Do you understand what you have here? I'm beginning to, he replied. This letter, she tapped one of the pages, is from William Foster to your Henry Blackwood. Foster later became the chairman of the Communist Party USA. But in 1912, when this was written, he was organizing steel workers. This connection has never been documented before. She moved to another document. And this meeting minutes from the Blackwood Cooperative Mining Association. We knew such an organization existed briefly, but all official records were destroyed in a suspicious fire in 1919. Historians have been trying to piece together its history for decades. Frank felt a surge of excitement. So these documents fill gaps in the historical record? Gaps? Dorothy laughed, a short, sharp sound. Mr. Reed, these documents could potentially rewrite entire chapters of local history. The cooperative mining experiment has been dismissed as a brief, failed attempt by radical elements. But these records suggest it was far more organized and successful than previously known. Frank spent the next 2 hours with Dorothy, going through the documents he'd brought and discussing their significance. By the time they finished, it was clear that his discovery was even more important than he had initially realized. I'd like to show you something, Dorothy said finally, leading him to a back room filled with filing cabinets. She pulled a large rolled map from a tube and spread it across a table. This is a survey map of the county from 1925, she explained. See these markings? She pointed to small red crosses scattered across the map. We've always believed these indicated locations of Union safe houses, places where organizers could hide during the violent crackdowns. But we've never been able to confirm it. Frank studied the map, his pulse quickening. One of the crosses marked the location of his farmhouse. I have a similar map, he said quietly. Found among the documents. Dorothy's eyes lit up. Mr. Reed, I think you should meet some other members of our board. Would you be available this evening? We have our monthly meeting at 7. Frank agreed readily and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the town. The county seat was small but charming, with a main street of brick buildings dating from the early 1900s. As he wandered, Frank couldn't help but see the town through a new lens, imagining it during the height of labor struggles. Picket lines forming outside the now abandoned factory at the edge of town, secret meetings held in the back rooms of what was now a quaint cafe. At precisely 7 o'clock, Frank returned to the Historical Society. Dorothy introduced him to the board, a collection of retired teachers, a local lawyer, and a fourth-generation miner turned amateur historian named Joe Kelly. Dorothy tells us you've made quite the discovery, Joe said after preliminaries were completed. He was a stocky man with calloused hands that spoke of decades of hard physical labor. I believe I have, Frank replied, though I'm still working to understand its full significance. Tell them what you told me, about how you found the documents, Dorothy encouraged. Frank described the hidden room in the basement, watching as the board members exchanged meaningful glances. When he finished, Joe leaned forward. Mr. Reed, what you've found might be connected to something much larger. Have you ever heard of the historical truth repositories? Frank shook his head. It's been something of a local legend among those of us interested in labor history, Joe explained. The story goes that during the height of repression, a network of people, workers, teachers, journalists, created hidden archives throughout coal country. They preserved documents that contradicted the company line, evidence of abuses, records of organizing efforts. Most historians dismiss it as myth, but some of us have been collecting evidence for years. Like the People's History Project that Harold mentioned, Frank murmured. Joe's eyebrows shot up. Harold Wilson?
He told you about the People's History Project?
Yes, he came by the farmhouse, Frank explained. Said the previous owner, Jenkins, had talked about it. Joe exchanged another look with Dorothy. Jenkins was, well, he was careful about who he shared information with. If he talked to Harold and Harold talked to you, that's significant. What Joe isn't saying, Dorothy interjected, is that there are still people in this county, descendants of the coal bosses, who wouldn't be happy about this history coming to light. Even after all these years, there are reputations and fortunes built on a sanitized version of the past. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying my discovery could be controversial? Historically significant things often are, Joe said with a wry smile. The question is, what do you want to do with what you've found? It was a question Frank had been pondering himself. As a historian, he believed in the importance of bringing hidden truths to light, but he also recognized the responsibility that came with handling primary sources that had been deliberately preserved for future generations. "I want to do right by it," Frank said finally. "Honor the efforts of those who kept these records safe. Make sure these voices from the past are finally heard." The board members nodded approvingly. "Then I think," Dorothy said, "we have an opportunity to make history while preserving it. If you're willing, Mr. Reed, we'd like to work with you to properly document and eventually exhibit these materials." "There's something else to consider," Joe added. "If your house contains one of these repositories, there may be others still undiscovered. The map you mentioned could be crucial to finding them before they're lost forever." Frank thought about the hidden room in his basement, preserved for over a century, waiting for someone to find it and understand its importance. How many other hidden chambers might exist throughout the region, holding pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal a more complete picture of the past? "I'm all in," Frank said, feeling a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced in years of academic work. "Where do we start?" Dorothy smiled. "We start by going back to your farmhouse. I think it's time we got a proper look at Henry Blackwood's legacy." As Frank drove back home that evening, with Dorothy and Joe following in their own vehicles, he felt like he was at the beginning of something momentous. The farmhouse he had purchased on a whim had turned out to be so much more than a fixer-upper project or a quiet retreat from academic life. It was a doorway to the past, and perhaps, in some small way, a chance to right historical wrongs by bringing long-silenced voices back into the conversation. 2 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Frank stood in the freshly painted front hallway of the farmhouse, straightening a framed photograph of Henry Blackwood that they'd discovered among the documents. The once dilapidated house was now fully restored, with careful attention paid to preserving its historical character while making it comfortably livable. But the most significant transformation had nothing to do with refinished hardwood floors or replaced window panes. It was what had happened in the basement. 5 minutes until opening, Dorothy called from the kitchen, where volunteers from the Historical Society were arranging refreshments. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Frank replied, adjusting his tie. The formal clothes felt strange after 2 years spent mostly in work clothes, covered in dust and paint. Today marked the official opening of what they'd come to call the People's Archive, a small but powerful museum housed in the renovated basement of Frank's farmhouse. The hidden room had been carefully expanded, its contents meticulously catalogued, and a proper climate-controlled storage area added to preserve the original documents. The idea had evolved naturally over the months following Frank's discovery. What began as a personal fascination had grown into a collaborative project involving not just the Historical Society, but also regional universities, labor historians, and community members who came forward with additional materials once word spread about Frank's find. "Professor Reed," a voice called from outside. Frank stepped onto the porch to greet Robert Chen, his former department chair, who had made the 2-hour drive from the university with 3 other colleagues. "This is quite a change from your lecture hall," Frank laughed, shaking Robert's hand. "A change for the better, I think." "I've been following your research publications about the documents," Robert said. "Fascinating stuff. You've made quite a splash in academic circles, it was true." The papers Frank had published based on the Blackwood documents had attracted attention from historians nationwide. The forgotten story of the mining cooperative, the network of activists preserving their own history, the connections to wider labor movements all had proven to be significant contributions to historical understanding. But today wasn't about academic recognition. It was about returning these stories to the community where they belonged. By 11 o'clock, cars lined the gravel driveway and spilled onto the road. Local families, history enthusiasts, journalists, and even a few politicians had come for the opening. Frank had worried that the rural location might limit attendance, but the opposite had proven true. People seemed drawn to the authenticity of visiting history in its original setting. Harold Wilson, now a trusted friend, arrived early and positioned himself near the basement entrance, ready to help guide visitors. At 84, he'd become an enthusiastic volunteer, connecting threads of local oral history to the written records Frank had found. "Big day," Harold remarked as Frank passed by. "Old Jenkins would be pleased, I think." "I hope so," Frank agreed. The formal ribbon cutting was scheduled for noon. As people gathered in front of the house, Frank took a moment to step away, walking to the edge of his property where the land sloped gently down to the creek. The same view that had first captured his attention when he visited the property now grounded him whenever the project became overwhelming. So much had changed in 2 years. What had started as an impulse purchase, a city professor's midlife escape, had become his life's most meaningful work. The farmhouse was now truly his home, and the surrounding community had become much more than a setting. He had formed friendships, particularly with the team from the Historical Society, that felt deeper than many he'd developed during 20 years in academia. "There you are," Joe's voice interrupted his thoughts. Almost showtime. Frank turned to see the retired miner approaching. Joe had become the project's most dedicated volunteer, spending countless hours helping to organize and interpret the materials. His knowledge of mining history and local families had proven invaluable. "Just getting some air," Frank said. "Nervous?" Joe asked, coming to stand beside him. "A little," Frank admitted. "I keep thinking about Henry Blackwood and what he intended when he created that hidden room. Was this what he hoped for? Or would he be horrified to see his secret exposed?" Joe considered this. "From what we've learned about the man, I think he'd be proud. He wasn't hiding these things to keep them secret forever. He was preserving them until they could be safely revealed." "That time is now," Frank nodded. Over the past 2 years, they'd uncovered more about Henry Blackwood, through both his documents and other sources. A successful businessman who had become increasingly sympathetic to labor causes, Blackwood had used his position to support workers in ways that would have made him deeply unpopular among his peers. The hidden room wasn't just about preserving history. It had also been about protecting himself and others involved in the movement. "You're right," Frank said. "And we've done right by him, I think." Following the map found in Blackwood's collection, Frank and the Historical Society had located 3 other repositories in the county, one in the attic of what had been a schoolhouse, another behind a false wall in a church basement, and a third beneath the floorboards of the former newspaper office. Each had yielded its own collection of documents, adding pieces to a historical puzzle that had been deliberately scattered for protection. "Time to head back," Joe said, gesturing toward the house where people were beginning to gather for the ceremony. The ribbon cutting itself was brief, but meaningful. The county commissioner, whose great-grandfather had worked in the Blackwood cooperative mine, did the honors. Afterward, visitors were guided through the house in small groups, eventually making their way to the basement museum. Frank positioned himself in the hidden room, now transformed into the main exhibit space. He watched as people reacted to what they saw: the original documents in display cases, the interactive timeline of local labor history, the wall of photographs showing ordinary people whose stories had nearly been lost. A middle-aged woman approached him, eyes bright with emotion. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the cooperative mine," she said. "No one believed him. The official histories all said it failed within months, but he insisted it ran for nearly 3 years and would have succeeded if not for the company's sabotage." She gestured to one of the displays, which showed exactly that narrative, backed by Blackwood's records. He would have been so validated by this. These moments made everything worthwhile: the 2 years of painstaking work, the considerable financial investment, the academic career left behind. Frank had found his calling not in teaching history from textbooks, but in helping to recover it from the shadows. By late afternoon, as the crowds began to thin, Dorothy found Frank sitting on the porch steps. "I'd call that a success," she said, lowering herself to sit beside him. "Over 300 visitors, and the guest book is full of people planning to return with their families." "It went well," Frank agreed. "But this is just the beginning." Dorothy nodded. "The board voted last night. We're proceeding with the grant application for the countywide project." This had been their most ambitious vision, using Frank's Farmhouse Museum as a model for a series of similar sites throughout the region, each telling a piece of the larger story. The Coal Country Historical Trail would link locations where repositories had been found, along with mines, company towns, and sites of significant strikes or organizing activities. "You know," Dorothy said after a moment, "when you first walked into the Historical Society 2 years ago, I never imagined we'd end up here," Frank laughed. "That makes 2 of us. I just wanted a quiet place to write my book, the Sea. Book, a historical account of the people's History Project and the network of activists who had preserved their own narrative was now scheduled for publication the following year. It would bring these local stories to a national audience. As the sun began to set, the last visitors departed, and the volunteers gathered in Frank's kitchen for a celebratory meal. Looking around at these people who had become his friends and collaborators, Frank felt a profound sense of gratitude. His impulsive purchase of an abandoned farmhouse had led him not just to hidden treasure but to a community and purpose he hadn't known he was seeking. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet once more, Frank made his way down to the basement. The museum lights were off, but he navigated the familiar space easily, eventually standing before the photograph of Henry Blackwood that held the central position in the exhibit. "We did it," he said quietly to the serious-faced man in the image. "Your stories are being told. Your work wasn't in vain." For a moment, in the stillness of the basement where secrets had been kept safe for a century, Frank felt a sense of connection across time, to Blackwood, to Jenkins, to all those who had played a part in preserving these fragments of truth for future generations to discover. The farmhouse had drawn him in with its mystery, but it was the human stories held within its walls that had transformed his life. What he had found in the basement wasn't just a collection of old papers. It was a legacy of courage, foresight, and commitment to ensuring that history would remember not just the powerful, but the everyday people who had shaped their communities against tremendous odds. As Frank climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he reflected that some treasures couldn't be measured in dollars. The true value of what he'd discovered lay in the connections restored, between past and present, between official history and lived experience, between himself and a community he now proudly called home.